You're all very welcome. My name's Emily Shakespeare. I'm Communications Manager at the LRG, and you're very welcome to our Research Fund Showcase, where we proudly show off some of our funded projects, and our speakers will be guiding you through some fascinating landscapes today. So this actually follows on from an event we had in March, which was the same cohort, the other half of, I suppose, the class of 2021 of our funded project, and around the theme of landscape, virtue, and the common good. So before we get going, I just want to get a couple more dates in your diary, if we could, please. So there was one more recipient from this cohort, the class of 2021, and that was actually Matthew Rofe and Michael Rittmeester. So they were actually guest editors of an upcoming special issue in our Landscape Research Journal. And so they'll be hosting a panel with a couple of their authors on the 26th of June, and the theme will be around the complexity of contested landscapes. So all that's on our website, and a little bit further in advance, because it takes a little bit more prep, in October we'll be organised, or we have organised, a critical field study of Dunkirk in France, and that's a 3-day itinerary where we explore different perspectives of the landscape in the town. So that's the 16th to the 18th of October. Details on our website, and I hope to get out kind of firm costs and draft itinerary by the end of June, so keep an eye out for that, please. So back to today, just a little bit of housekeeping. This is recorded, so I'll be able to put it onto our website afterwards, and I'm going to do my usual sales pitch, that if you're not already, please become a member of LRG, and that way you'll be able to support us, support you, and some lovely landscape research like the ones you're going to hear about today. I'm going to introduce our brand new CEO, Brian Kilkelly. He's just joined us a couple of months ago, so if you want to say a couple of words, Brian, to say hello.
Sure, will do. Fantastic. Thanks, Emily. Thanks for the great introduction. And thanks, everybody, for joining. Really lovely to meet you all. I joined about a month ago. Really great to be here. I've been working on climate change and sustainability in urban and rural environments for about 15 years. So it's wonderful to discover the Landscape Research Group and to be invited to come and help grow the organisation. We've got a real passion for increasing the impact of the research and the studies work we do, reaching new audiences, expanding the people who get involved. I've had lots of experience in that area, and I'm looking forward to bringing that to the Institute. So yeah, good to meet you all. And it's my pleasure also to introduce Karen to you, Professor Karen Jones. Karen is Professor of Environmental and Cultural History at the University of Kent. And Karen is, we're very grateful that she coordinates the research and policy work of the Landscape Research Group for us, and does a fantastic job at helping us to make sure that we're maximising the impact of the funds that we have. So Karen, over to you.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks everyone for coming. It's we were just while we were setting up talking that this is if you're in the UK at least, it's a great way to ease towards the weekend, and if you're anywhere else in the world, it's equally a good time to be listening to landscape and ideas, and sort of conjuring with all of our projects. So I've got 3 presentations by a past cohort of research project award holders. I can see in the audience a couple of people with who are holding our awards subsequently. So this is your future in front of you of presenting for us. Just to remind everyone here too, the next the time frame for the next set of awards will be February. So look out for that. We'll be announcing a theme, but I think these events are really good illustrations of the kind of work we're really interested in sponsoring, and sort of applied and connected work on landscape that thinks about interdisciplinarity and different approaches and social justice issues in the round. So the way it will work this afternoon is I will introduce each of our groups of presenters. They will talk for about 15 minutes, and then that will leave us a chunk of time at the end for Q&A to pose to individual presenters, or I think it would be nice too if anyone along the way gathers questions that perhaps can tie the presentations together, or we can ask our presenters about their approaches to some of these questions that are being showcased for us this afternoon. Okay, if anybody wants to put questions in the chat before the end, I know my mind is a bit like a sieve, so that works for me to do that, and then please feel free to do so, and we're very happy to articulate those later on. And we would ask as well, while our presenters are talking, if everyone can turn their cameras and mutes off. So again, this is a message for myself so that the dog doesn't interrupt proceedings. Okay, wonderful. Let's go. So our first presenters are Lewis Braddock-Clark and Susanna Zagurska, who are talking about their project, Out of Focus, Cinematic Readings of a Shaken Landscape, which thinks about film and colonialism, extraction and indigenous cosmology. So a real sort of multidisciplinary, multi-format piece. So I'm really excited to hear what you guys have got to say. So over to you.
Thank you so much. Okay, we'll just share the screen. Okay, I think everyone can see the screen, right? Perfect, yeah. So yeah, I'm Louis.
And I'm Susan.
We work as an artist duo. As researchers and creative practitioners, we survey the landscapes of geological anomalies, anthropogenic displacement, and technocultures. Using experimental techniques, we challenge and explore the boundaries of documentary filmmaking in times of accelerated geographies. And we are both lecturers at the Royal Academy of Art. So we're kind of coming from this artistic research background. So our talk is actually going to be a kind of poetic performance rather than a kind of didactic looking back on our field research. So we'd also like to thank the Landscape Research Group for inviting us to share our research today, and also for supporting our project. We will share insights into our ongoing film production, our artistic research, and the field trip we conducted to Meteorite Island. Out of Focus is an experimental research body exploring climate change, mineral extraction, and post-colonialism in Inuit Nunat, northern Greenland. We look through material lenses and indigenous storytelling. Our talk will take you down the Crimson Cliffs, past the Fjord of the Dead, and over the Signal Mountain.
A harpoon of light cuts through the heavens. The night sky turns to fire. A sound of 1,000 whales. Agne Kichok, woman, dog, Havik 1, Tura, Havik 2, and Akparirik smash into the sleepy landscape of Imna Minaman. As they hit the ice, their memories melt away. The walking stones forget where they come from, willing to offer the spirits to a new ground. In Salambo, a novel from 1862, Gustave Flaubert poetically portrays, quote, the Abadir stones which had fallen from the moon, whirling in slings of silver thread, unquote. Meteorites have inspired generations of artists, poets, and filmmakers to dream about other worlds and reflect on human positioning within the universe. Around 10,000 years ago, a meteor shower hit the grounds of the present-day Cape York Peninsula in northern Greenland. The fragments of walking stones spread across the Crimson Cliffs, past the Fjord of the Dead, and over the Signal Mountain. In Out of Focus, we explore the unique ability of these iron meteorites to lock in magnetic information. So on the map, you can see the place we traveled to. As a meteoroid...
Guys, just so you know, sorry to interrupt, but we can't see your slides moving.
Oh, no?
Oh, really?
You might need to.
Which slide do you
Sorry for
see?
that.
Yeah, so we at the moment we just see down the crimson cliffs.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
Then we need to show the post selection.
Okay.
Ah, yep, now it's moved. Thank you.
Okay. As a meteoroid burns through the Earth's atmosphere, it heats up above its Curie temperature. This 570 degrees Celsius hot spell rewrites the stone's magnetic data to match the earthly parameters and simultaneously erasing the information about its cosmic origin. These special powers of storing, erasing, and overwriting data gave iron meteorites the nicknames of hard drives from space. The geological anomaly of falling stars sparked technological advancement in the Arctic. The people of northern Greenland, called Inuit, mined valuable ores from the extraterrestrial material. Using basalt stones as hammers, they would chip off meteorite fragments and model their devices. With every clang, bang, and dong, they would unknowingly cause stress magnetism effect, changing the properties of the material. Alongside the technological application, the cultural significance of meteorites flourished in myths and drum songs. The Inuit gave names to the walking stones who became protagonists of their stories. Inspired by the idea of breathing spirits into meteorites, Arna Kichok, woman, dog, Havik 1, Tura, Havik 2, and Akpalirik. These are the fragments of Cape York meteorites. They reappear as non-human characters in our research. Through a series of decolonizing rituals in the Arctic and art scientific experiments at paleomagnetic labs, samples of Cape York meteorite become remagnetized. In the process of rewriting their magnetic histories, new stories emerge.
In the past, the Havidimuk people of Great Irons decapitated the woman meteorite and sledged her head away. This act maddens the weather demon, Tupalak, who pierced a crack through the ice sheet, swallowing the heavenly stone. The thieves narrowly escaped death, but learned that nature shelters its own deposits. Today, geologists drill out, cut off, and measure up mineral samples. As a result of climate change, mineral deposits previously hidden under the ice cap are revealed. The prospects of acquiring new land with, quote, the most interesting assets and vast deposit potentials, unquote, inspire mining startups to dig and explore. Prices of minerals shrink and expand like the Arctic ice. The licenses for digging become investments for global players who actually bet in favor of the unfolding ecological catastrophe. In this landscape of speculation, an uncertain climate may liquefy into cash flow. The melting of ice only encourages the extractive mechanism present in this landscape for centuries. Parallel to Danish colonization, the 19th century North Pole expeditions, such as those led by the American Robert Peary, set out to find and retrieve mineral trophies. In this process, the Greenlandic meteorites found their ways to museums in New York and Copenhagen. The relocation of heaven stones aligned with the displacement of the Inuit people, who guided their cherished resources to the western shorelines. Parallel to the extraction of Anakitsok meteorite, Peary took a group of Greenlanders to New York. The indigenous people were disgracefully displayed as a living anthropological zoo at the American Museum of Natural History. A century later, after a series of evictions instigated by colonial powers, forced migration is again prompted by mining ventures. Dredgers, bulldozers, earth augers, oil drums, and diesel generators creep into the settlements and nomadic hunting grounds. And yet the traditional Inuit way of life is not only threatened by mining. During a Cafe Mig on our field research trip in Meteorite Island, the elder Kanak Nielsen shared his thoughts about the dangers of the erratic climate. So this is Kanyak, and I will just quote him now on what he said. These animals, polar bears and narwhals, come and go. They are living with the weather. One winter they are here, and the next winter they are not here. The weather is very unstable. Hunting nowadays is hard and tiring, especially for those who rely on it, unquote. The locals do not only depend on wildlife as a source of food, but also consider hunting rituals as the beating heart of their identity. Climate instability disrupts the traditional way of life of the Inuit by leaving them to a tragic choice between the life-threatening danger of hunting on thin ice or the distress of employment in the post-colonial power structure. For the Greenlandic society, the live geology of their island can either become a garden or a grave. The auctioning of mineral licenses contributes to a level of political and economic independence from Denmark. In this view, Greenland's natural heritage shifts from common good to commodity. By doing so, the garden of metals would become liberated from post-colonial power. But on the other hand, it would be sliced open by foreign mineral extraction. And these dilemmas continue to haunt the landscape today.
Anirnik, breath. Anirnit, many breaths. Hila, a breath of life. The spirit of every living being is borrowed from the sky and the air around them. I am a seal. I inhale the frosty ghosts to guard me underwater. I seek out a beautiful harpoon head in order to exhale my life without pain. If the design follows the rule of ritual and custom, my spirit will reside in the harpoon head for one night after my death. The indigenous cosmology animates the landscape as a breathing system. According to the Inuit, the breaths, meaning spirits, of all living beings are borrowed from Hila, which stands for the weather, climate, consciousness, and mind, and many other things. In the moment of death, bodies return their breaths back to the landscape. And this exchange of spirit portrays nature as a network of interconnected parts. In northern Greenland, the cycles of life and death are experienced daily, at the edge of the sea ice, at the breathing holes, on dock sledges, and in kayaks. Traditionally, and still to this day, the Inuit use iron harpoons for hunting. According to a myth recorded in 1929 by the anthropologist Knut Rasmussen, quote, "The soul of a seal resides in the harpoon head for one night after the seal has been killed," unquote. Making harpoon heads out of extraterrestrial metal, perhaps the Inuit envisioned the capacity of iron meteorites to lock in magnetic data. Inspired by the Inuit relationship with the landscape ruled by weather demons, staggering rocks, and exchanges of breaths, our project Out of Focus proposes a new reading of the Greenlandic tormented tundra. The indigenous idea of Hila, connecting all living things, finds its contemporary representation in soundtracks woven out of geomagnetic waves. And here we will describe a little bit our methodology. Our custom-made microphones called geotools detect magnetic anomalies caused by climate change and mineral displacement. Data output, amplified by the shifting weather, is converted into sonic representation. By immersing audiences in these sounds, we would like to challenge the colonial extractive relationship with the Arctic landscape. And additionally, the fragments of walking stones, the meteorites shipped out of Greenland by colonizers and explorers, return to the Arctic landscape. The restitution of mineral trophies is followed by the procedure of inserting a new magnetic moment into meteorite samples. Organized in collaboration with the Havihivik community, all hunters, elders, artisans, shamans, and children are involved in this ritual. With a simple blowtorch, a meteorite fragment is heated up above its Curie temperature. This hot spell erases the stone's magnetic history, and what happens on an alchemical level, the colonial weight is lifted, triggering a new opening.
We believe that immersive methods of storytelling evoke a deeper emotional response compared to scientific visualizations like pie charts, data percentages. In geomorphic video, art theorist Ursula Byman calls for the urgency of an embodied interpretation of scientific data. She says, quote, "It is fairly easy to access vast amounts of scientific data about the climate and environment, but the explanation alone of the data cannot help us to understand the magnitude of the change ahead of us. Aesthetics that are capable of reaching the imaginary will be necessary, and these often court a fictional status," unquote. Encouraged by these words, our research, Out of Focus, creates material imaginaries that step beyond the static world of scientific communication. For our custom microphones, the viewer can immerse in the spectral polyphony of disrupted geology, ice-carving thunders, narwhal electro-clicking, frantic beluga sopranos, nomadic radio chatter, helicopter blades clapping, and hunting boats rumble, tune the listeners further into this accelerated geography. Research methods present in our project align also with Bruno Latour's criticism of anthropogenic aesthetics. He says in the verifiable image of the world, we are so accustomed to seeing our blue planet from the outside in, as if we were imprisoned in a raucous space station or sitting on the throne of God, that we have completely forgotten to what extent this astronomical image of the world poorly reflects the common habitat shared by the living, unquote. Looking at the Earth from above creates the illusion of separation, in which the viewer seemingly does not participate in the object of viewing, that is, shifting landscapes. This way of seeing certainly remains a deception, as humans are, of course, part of nature and Earth is our habitat. Surprisingly, even when artistically addressing the issues of the Anthropocene, many methods and tools are identical to those used in landscape extraction, drone filming, satellite mapping, remote sensing. In this way, the images of ecological disasters fall into a category of horrifying, but yet sublime aesthetics. Admitting to Latour's criticism of probing the Earth outside in, our strategy is to trace the evidence of shifting landscape from the inside out. Through listening to the sounds of fluctuating geomagnetic fields, we are guided across the terrain. And in this way, sonic maps conduct a dramaturgy of navigating in space, composing a type of non-linear narrative. And this approach invites the landscape to speak, to scream, and stutter.
Applying the perspective of object-oriented ontology by looking through the material lenses of the landscape, our project constructs a narrative that shifts away from the colonial framing. Besides physical conquest, the Danish and American colonizers constructed their own hierarchical interpretations of the Greenlandic landscape and culture. To bypass these biased perspectives, the fragments of Cape York meteorites become important non-human storytellers and story triggers throughout the project. But in our project, in our research, out of focus, not only objects speak. The Arctic materialities are always explored in relation to their human inhabitants. Out of focus becomes a platform that gives voice to the Inuit people who are directly bound with the landscape. Our communication with the local community was made possible by the Kanak hunter and rock and roll musician Alekatchak Perry, who not only followed in the footsteps of the Walking Stones, but also of his great-great-grandfather Robert Perry, the American explorer who had brought the Cape York meteorite Arnakichok to New York in 1897. Over the last year, the stories narrated by the people of Great Irons have been translated from Inuktun to English by Miyuki Daorana from Kanak. Her background in anthropogenic anthropology contributes to building a climate-aware narrative from an Inuit position. Additionally, we hope that our efforts to transcribe and translate spoken accounts would contribute to the preservation of this language, which is a vanishing language spoken by less than 900 people.
Okay, I think we will finish it there, but we just want to say, yeah, we're really thankful to the research group for funding our research on these topics and supporting our first field trip to Northern Greenland. And since then, we've also conducted a second field trip, and we're going to be producing a type of documentary film as an outcome. So thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lewis. Thanks, thanks, Louis and Zuza for that wonderful look at the material and the imaginary. And I really like the idea of sort of inversion and looking from the inside and of a breathing world and a spectral world. So hopefully there'll be some questions at the end that speak to those amazing approaches and particularly the integration of the co-production of Indigenous perspective, which is really good. Fab. Okay, our next presenter is Ana Claudia Martini, who's going to talk to us about a different kind of watery landscape, I suppose. and in this instance in Japan, I'm thinking perhaps about some cognate issues around resistance and space. Her presentation is called The Right to be Vulnerable, Seawars, Resistance and Protest Movements. So over to you, Anna Claudia.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. You can see here my PowerPoint. Let me know if you can see it.
Yeah, that's up.
Okay, then I will start. Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Claudia Martini. I'm assistant professor at the University of Bologna in Italy, and I'm a geographer, even though I am trained as a cultural anthropologist, and before that, as a cultural expert in Japanese language and culture. So the first thing I want to say is, of course, a big thank you for helping me go through with this project, fund part of it, and allow me to also have the time and the funding to work on something that has not been my research focus for many years. I've been working on Japan since 2014, but I've been working on the intersection between geographies of affect, disaster, and tourism. I've been going to Japan since 2014, and while going to Japan, to the same communities in northeastern Japan year after year, what I discovered is that my research was also moving with them and with their interests. So while at the beginning, the idea of tourism, of having tourism in areas like Fukushima was the focus, slowly around 2019, 2020, the same people I met in my years in Japan started talking about a new issue that was very felt and very emotional for them, which is the issue around the construction of new seawalls in Japan. So I think most of us remember the 2011 disaster. Just to be very brief about it, there was a 9.2 earthquake, the third most destructive earthquake ever recorded in history. Then a tsunami, which had peaks of up to 30 plus meters in certain areas. And the combination of earthquake and tsunami caused the nuclear disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. This, of course, caused 20,000 casualties and a lot of destruction. So the recovery process was long, was very contested. And one of the most contested ideas was the construction of new seawalls along 400 kilometers of coast, which would cover the coast completely. We're talking about seawalls from 15 up to 18 meters, sometimes higher in other parts. Japan has been known in academia as a concrete state. When we think about Japan, we think about cherry blossoms and lovely rural landscapes or the urban landscape of Tokyo or Osaka. But actually, since the 60s in Japan, a lot of money has been used to create concrete infrastructures, whether it's buildings, or in many cases, sea defenses. One of the sea defenses after the disaster is that of Bochote, which is the seawalls. Actually, seawalls were in place before the disaster. We're talking about 7 to 10 meters seawalls, and those seawalls were completely washed away during the disaster. So scientific literature and local communities actually agree in saying that building higher seawalls is going to cause more problems than it helps solving. So, okay. In terms of the theoretical framework that I would like to use and that I've been using to look at this issue, I'm using landscape justice as a framework on the one hand, and affect studies and the ways they connect to landscape. So when I talk about landscape justice, I mean the ways, the multiple and varied and complex ways in which landscape acts as a canvas, as a repository in which unequal experiences and unequal power relations are highlighted. So there's an equal exposure to risk and harm, an equal authority in deciding the shape that the landscape has to take for the future of this community. And I use in particular Iris Marion Young's idea of recognition justice. So the idea that the only way to have proper justice is to recognize the difference, not only of different groups, but all the possible differences within groups. And ultimately, I also advanced the idea that CEOs could be seen as a form of disaster capitalism, in the sense that the government has decided to build them even after most of the communities, actually all the communities I've visited in the past 4 years, have clearly stated that they do not want the walls. And I will explain why they don't want walls that are supposedly there to protect them. The other theoretical framework I use is that of affect studies. Just in brief, what I want to highlight is that for me as a researcher, it's very important to recognize that often we have to decide as researcher, but also as people in our life, between decisions, and our choices have to do not only with logic, but with our perceptions and our emotions especially. So the question is, when I first went back to Japan in 2019 and people started talking to me about the seawalls, well, but if you had such a huge tsunami, why are you protesting against the construction of these defenses? And the general idea is that for the people living there, this is a landscape issue, a landscape justice issue. As empowerment is emphasized in disaster management, and in Japan especially, the government in the reconstruction process has emphasized community participation and listening to the community as part of the process. Still, we need to ask if these walls are being constructed and have been constructed, unfortunately, whose knowledge sets, beliefs, and values ultimately get empowered in this process. And Davis and Groves says, the territorialization of the imagined futures of the powerful deterritorializes the imagined futures of the marginalized. So we have, on the one hand, a community that is opposing these walls, and I will let one of the people I interviewed explain why. So this activist from Otsuchi, one of the towns in Japan that were hit by the tsunami, says, at the time of the tsunami, we already had walls 7 meters high, and they were washed away. Actually, all the seawalls, bar one, were washed away in 2011, all of them throughout 300 kilometers. Many did not escape because they were convinced that the walls would have protected them. With higher walls, in the future, there will be more casualties. So we start to see what I call the right to a vulnerable landscape. The problem for the community is not that the seawalls are ineffective and they will be washed away. Of course, that's part of the problem, but the bigger issue is that the seawalls give a false sense of security that in 2011 has proved fatal for 20,000 people who did not escape because they trusted the walls to protect them. And that has been, well, you can find it in many interviews about the disaster. And then I would like to also read from Tomoyuki Miura. He's a member of the city council, also an anti-seawall activist in the municipality of Kezenuma. And when I talked to him about what did they do to oppose the seawalls, he said, we brought our own simulations to correct the official ones proposed by the government, and we were sure that the walls could have at least been lowered. Many of us think that the wall is unnecessary and that we'd rather need to think about an alternative plan for the development of the town, Oyakaidan, which includes better escape routes, the construction of houses more uphill. The thing is, the reconstruction plan mandates that the money has to first be allotted for the wall. Urban reconstruction comes last in the budget. So we also see how the government plan does not take into account what the priorities are for the community. And the fisherman from a town nearby says, inland, many are saying that they feel safer with the wall, but those living close to the ocean are against it. We were never given any alternative by the prefecture and the government. From the beginning, their position was so firm that even if there is an opposition, we could have never stopped this. So there are several situations and several, on the one hand, the communities are quite united in opposing the size of the seawall mainly, and in agreeing on the fact that it would be better to implement alternative, more sustainable options for sea defense, not only to have a sort of more appealing landscape, but also to have a landscape that remains vulnerable. I will tell you some of these alternative defenses that the communities have come up with. You see many pictures, so you see upright the kin and he. This is a traditional means of protection against tsunami. It's a stone that is usually put at the border of where the tsunami reached. So if a tsunami reached 3 kilometers inland, then 3 kilometers inland a tsunami stone is placed. And this stone tells people not to build houses beyond that point. Of course, in Japan, once they built seawalls, they started building houses closer and closer to the sea. Then they proposed more effective evacuation routes. Many people died in the evacuation areas because those evacuation areas were not fit for the size of the tsunami that arrived. They are proposing new signage so people know that they are going through a tsunami-prone area. They are proposing especially the Great Forest Wall. So why don't we build seawalls with not actual concrete, but with trees, and let the trees protect us and slow the tsunami down? And then the last, and actually almost the most important for the communities, is kataribe. Kataribe is a Japanese word that means traditional storyteller, storyteller, but it refers to people in these communities that keep alive the memory of the disaster and that can offer knowledge and offer information about disasters, especially now with climate change. Disasters are becoming more and more pervasive, and people don't really know how to deal with unpredictability. Japanese people are very prepared for disaster. They know what to do when there is a tsunami. They know what to do when there is an earthquake. Infrastructure is there, knowledge is there. But at this time, with climate change, we're actually seeing a different scenario, a different landscape, in which disasters are becoming more and more pervasive and more violent. And they're marked by this unpredictability, whose knowledge we don't have yet. And we don't know how to protect from this new type of disaster. I don't know how much time I have left, but I don't think much. So I'll show you 3 pictures that describe different landscape. Since I read Tomoyuki Miura's opinion, I would like you to focus on the lower right. This is actually Oyakaigan, seen from above. And their solution actually in the municipality, because if you remember, they said that first the money was going to go for the wall and then for urban infrastructure, which includes also road. They decided with the government to create a hybrid form in which the seawall is also the highway, so they could mobilize the money without having to wait years for the construction of the wall. So in the end, the question that my research tries to partly answer is whose knowledge counts in such complex situation. We see that there's no right or wrong answer. We have a technocratic approach, which is the preferred approach of the government and the prefecture. it limits environmental risk. It's something concrete in more sense than one that can prove that the government is doing something, but it has a huge impact on the landscape, a huge physical impact, and a huge cultural impact and religious impact even. In Shinto religion, in many coastal communities, people have all their religious occurrences close to the sea. But if now they cannot access the sea, then it becomes a problem that is bigger than not being able to see the sea. It becomes a problem of not being able to perform the tradition. On the other hand, we have communities asking to maintain a degree of short-term risk. Let's build lower walls. Let's remain scared. Let's remain a bit on our toes. So if something happens, we will just flee. Let's remain vulnerable in the short term so we can be safer in the long term. That's their approach. And that's what I've been really interested in studying. I think my time is up, so I will let this end by saying that this does not regard just the disaster area, but also other areas of Japan. That's why I talk about disaster capitalism. Other areas which are not prone for like they don't experience tsunami, have been concretized, tetrapods have been built, sea defenses have been built. So it looks more like an economic situation rather than a safety situation. And yes, I will just maybe share this briefly. Thank you again for helping me with this project. At the moment, I have 3 articles and I presented the project using the Landscape Research Group logo at actually 5 conferences. And I'm making also a short documentary. I managed to interview 2 key informants, a Shinto priestess who's doing a lot of work about memory in the area, and the fishermen. So hopefully it will be done by the end of the summer. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna Claudia. That was fab. Again, a really, really fascinating intervention on those collisions between knowledge and risk, and who creates knowledge and who's listened to. I thought that sense of choosing to be vulnerable is a really interesting one, and one that thinks about the sort of emotional politics of these questions around environmental protection and catastrophe. So thanks very much. Okay, on to our last paper, our last presentation of our session today, from Jane Russell O'Connor, who is talking to us about why people are drawn to certain landscapes. So her focus is County Waterford, Ireland, and thinking through visitor experience in that particular geography. So over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Karen. And thank you to Landscape Research, because I've actually ventured into an area that I've not really done a great deal of research on in the past. And because of the grant and the funding that was available, it meant that I could actually explore another area of research that I hadn't previously looked at. So I'm actually an ecologist. I'm practicing ecologist as well as a lecturer in Southeast Technological University, formerly Waterford Institute of Technology. And I teach architects all environment and ecology modules. So the research, where it all began, well, I swim in the sea, and this is the Gillamine where I swim in Ireland. I live in Tramore, which is on the southeast of Ireland, and I'll show you some pictures of that in a minute. Now, myself and Dr. Maeve Savage, who is also a lecturer in WITO and SETU, we swim a lot together, and we often have conversations about, you know, what people talk about when they're by the sea, why people are drawn to the sea. And during COVID, we noticed a huge increase in the amount of people that were actually swimming. And I'd done some research previously about how people experience happiness in different types of landscape, and published in a book about the sublime landscape. And so I then decided that maybe it would be a good idea to sort of explore this further, and the funding opportunity came up. Myself and Maeve had a lot of conversations around this topic area, and we decided to, continue with this research and look at it in a lot more detail. But rather than just looking at the seascape, we decided to look at the mountainscape as well as the seascape. So we were very interested in what people did when they were in the landscape, but more importantly, what they were actually, why they were there in the first place, what they were drawn to, why was it they were actually in that landscape in the first place, rather than just doing the activities, and what sort of experiences did they have, what sort of emotions did those landscapes evoke. So really, the core of this research was based around how people connected with the landscape on both a physical and obviously a spiritual level. So we were looking at the differences in terms of two quite different landscapes, so mountainscape and seascape, because we were trying to look at to see whether the feelings that people express when they were talking about the seascape were similarly felt in something completely different like the mountainscape. So the project actually became rather large. We actually had a number of objectives, some of which we're still yet to utilize fully, and I'll talk about that at the end. But we actually ended up generating a huge amount of data. So today's presentation is really my own personal interpretation rather than Maeve's, because Maeve comes from a completely different background to myself. Although we both grew up near the sea, we both spent a lot of time swimming in the sea. We also grew up near the mountains and spent a lot of time walking in the mountains as children. So to give you a bit of background about the two locations, you can see this is Tramore, which means big beach in Irish, in Gaeilge. And it's situated on the southeast coast of Ireland. It's got a huge cultural history. It was very popular in the 1800s as a seaside resort, but it dates back much further than that. And the bay itself is huge. It's basically about a 5-kilometre bay. And the beach itself is about 2 kilometres with an additional sand dune system on it. The whole area is actually protected under EU Habitats Directive as a special area of conservation, and also a special protection area for birds under the EU Birds Directive. So it's a protected landscape. You'll notice to the bottom left, there's a picture of a sailor. Now, there are 3 pillars on each of the headlands in the Bay of Tramore. And the one on the left doesn't have anybody stood on it, but the one on the right, which is called Westtown, has what we call the metal man stood on it. And he's basically stood there in sailor's clothes to point out to any mariners about the dangers of the rocks below. And this is because the Seahorse in the 1700s was actually shipwrecked just outside Tramore. And there was 390 souls lost. So there's a huge cultural history associated with Tramore, which dates back to quite a long period of time. The top picture to the right is actually the beach itself. And then here we have Newtown Cove, which is just about 2 kilometres away from the beach, but is where most people swim. So it's Newtown and Gillamey. There's basically 2 coves next to each other. So in contrast, the Cumra Mountains are about 15 kilometres away, and this is a mountain range that's also within Waterford County and is in the southeast of Ireland, as you can see on the map there. This is a beautiful landscape, and actually you can probably just about see in that left picture the sea. If you're up on the top of the Cumra Mountains, you can actually see the sea at Tramore and along the coast. So it's also a very popular destination for people for walking, and there's Mahon Falls, which is quite famous. The picture to the right is Cumshamon, which is a lake that's actually up in the mountains. So we surveyed 30 people. There were 30 participants, 7 of whom were women and 13 were men. Now, a number of the respondents didn't actually discriminate between favouring the seascape and the mountainscape. And some tended to go to the sea more because of ease of access. And this map to the right here shows you basically the locations where people travelled from to go to the Cumra Mountains. So we have obviously a lot of people that were living in Tramore still travel to the Cumra Mountains. And then Waterford City, there was a number of respondents that travelled from there, and then out in the countryside in the more rural areas in Waterford County. And then when we look at the map for Tremor, for why people actually travel to Tremor, or where the people who chose Tremor to travel to, you can see that there's similar kind of demographics. So basically people were coming from similar locations to travel to Tremor. And in terms of the preferences, the sea and mountains was probably the smallest, and then the mountainscape was the smallest, and the seascape and mountains were both of those was kind of a slightly larger proportion, but the greatest proportion of people actually preferred the seascape. Now, some of this could be because of myself and Maeve's associations, because our contacts in a lot of the local community would be related to sea-based activities. And when we were actually looking for respondents, we did actually find that to get respondents who preferred the mountains was a little bit more difficult. Even though we reached out to a number of mountaineering groups, we put posters up in cafes, we actually went to the mountains ourselves and gave out posters and leaflets to try and encourage people to take part in the study. And one of the other things that was quite interesting about the study was the ethnicity. Everybody that we interviewed was white, and you'll see that they come from a couple of different places. So there's white English, white Scottish, white South African, and white French. And in terms of people accessing the landscape, this is something that we were quite concerned about, but unfortunately at this time we haven't actually explored that in more detail. So the themes that I've explored for the report that's been sent in and within this presentation are really just these four main areas. So what draws people to the landscape, the emotions of being in the landscape and connecting with it, and the relationships that people have with the landscape. Also the concerns and fears about the landscape, and I'll touch on that in a minute. So when we looked at why people liked either of the landscapes, one of the things that kept coming up time and time again was that people had spent time in the landscapes as a child and had happy memories. And in particular, this was pertinent in relation to the seascape. And a lot of people had spent time at the beach or had learned to swim in the sea as children. And one of the other main draws was because of the stunning scenery, and that was common between both the mountainscape and the seascape. In particular, the mountains, people talked about the sense of space, about the wildness, and about the opportunity to get away from people, to switch off, to unburden. When people talked about the sea, they talked about how it's always changing. And in fact, because the sea is a changing landscape, because it's never the same whenever they go there, it seemed to have a lot more of an attraction for participants. So a lot of people said, you know, it's never the same water, it's always different water, that it's a changing environment, the colors are different, the birds that I see are different. So the elements of the landscape that change constantly in the seascape seem to be one of the reasons why people are actually drawn to it. You know, so sometimes when they'd be out at the seascape, it could be very wild and there could be huge drama with the waves crashing on the rocks, or it could be very calm and tranquil. Whereas in the mountains, when people talked about changes in the mountains, it was mostly in relation to the weather. And obviously, you know, there were different changes in terms of the colors with the different seasons with the plants. So some of the emotions that people basically articulated when they were in these landscapes really relate about how they felt kind of immersed in the sea for the seascape and basically just getting away from it all in the mountainscape. So a lot of people talked about the sense of calm, about the full immersion in the water. Some people said that they think about the water as being additional skin to themselves. But they did talk about the gratitude and the fact that they were very privileged of being exposed to this type of landscape. And this was in particular with the seascape. So a lot of people had a spiritual connection with the sea, and you know, they did talk repeatedly about it being, you know, a part of their being, that it was something that drew them there. And many of the sea swimmers that we talked to actually go there on a daily basis. Now, not everybody we interviewed were just swimmers. There was a mixture of people who were kayakers and surfers and paddleboarders, and there are some people who just walk along the beach. So there was a whole range of different activities encountered in the seascape. So one of the respondents said something that was quite pertinent, and I thought this was probably very significant, was that she said that being in the sea is seen as freedom. And this is just something that she actually said. I almost want to run to the water when I arrive, and then the cold shot makes me forget everything else going on in my life and makes me present and in the moment, appreciating the sensations in my hands and feet. This gives me recognition of the world and how important it is. It is the one time I feel at one with nature and completely comfortable. I'm almost emotional actually repeating that. It's very thought-provoking, the things that people actually say, you know, when they're talking about the seascape. So moving on to perhaps the mountainscape, and obviously we didn't have as many respondents who favoured the mountains, but they still had similar kinds of emotional experiences. So a feeling free was definitely a common theme between both landscapes, as was relaxation and calmness. But one of the big things about the mountainscape was, I think, probably because it's a little bit more isolated, whereas the likes of Tremor tends to be quite busy, was a lot of people talked about unburdening and disconnecting from modern living and getting away from it all. They also talked about the enjoyment of the physical activity of actually reaching the peak and the vastness of the mountains, the remoteness of the landscape, and how actually walking was a meditative act. Now, other people talked about swimming as being a meditative act as well. So one of the other themes that we explored was the relationship with the nature experienced in landscape. And as an ecologist, I was particularly interested in this because most people probably weren't aware that both sites were protected. And I didn't actually say about the Comores, but the Comores are also protected as special area of conservation under EU legislation. And definitely the relationship that people had in terms of nature was an appreciation of the beauty of the landscape, but they did recognize that that beauty was created by the diversity of the species of plants that were available. And they also talked about the pleasure and the thrill of seeing different species in the landscape, which was basically common in both landscape types. There was also a strong desire to protect the landscapes so that they are maintained in their current state. In terms of the Comores, people were very worried about, you know, the footfall and the impact that that would actually have on some of the vegetation and the habitats that were there. And in contrast to the sea, people were more concerned about the water quality. So when we talk about the concerns and fears about the landscape, that really connects very closely with people's connection with nature. And, you know, one of the things that people talked about was also the dangers in both of these landscapes. And I suppose this is, I kind of looked into this in a bit more detail because I was very interested in what sort of early explorers thought about, you know, climbing the Alps. And in fact, Simon Sharma writes about this quite extensively, about the thrill of, or the delightful horrors, basically, about the thrill of getting to the tops of the mountains, but it's still very dangerous. And that was definitely thoughts that people expressed when they were talking about the walking in the mountainscape. And especially more so with the mountainscape, people were talked about being humbled by it and being in awe of it. That wasn't mentioned as much in comparison with the seascape. Now, in terms of concerns, everybody was concerned about climate change, but in particular with respect to the mountains, a number of participants talked about the disappearing glaciers and climate change and how this might have a long-term impact, you know, on the mountain region themselves. With the sea, there wasn't really much talk of climate change in terms of sea level rises, but they certainly talked about some of the changing species, and especially the swimmers, because there has been obviously a change in some of the species that we're seeing now. So in terms of other fears with relation to the seascape, people also talked about the thrill of swimming in terms of the fear of what lies beneath. And, you know, whilst you're swimming in this open body of water, you know, there is the possibility that there's other species that are bigger than you in there at the same time. Now, just to put it into context, for those of you who don't know Ireland, it is actually very cold. I was in the water this morning. The temperature is 16 degrees, which is very warm, and that's the warmest it would normally be. So we don't tend to get sharks, not many of them anyway. We do tend to get a lot of seals, and we do get basking sharks, but we don't get sharks that might actually cause any damage to you. But people still have a fear of swimming. Sometimes the fear is related to kind of the dangers of actually being out in open water, you know, with the tides, with the currents, and what might happen if the weather changes suddenly. But one of the biggest concerns, as I said earlier, was the fact that water quality and sort of deteriorating water quality in coasts around Ireland was actually a particular concern. And a number of people were very pleased to say that Tramore is actually a lot cleaner than it used to be, and it now has its blue flag status. So in terms of the concluding themes, there was an awful lot in this research. We had interviews that took between 30 and 70 minutes in some cases, and people were actually very keen to talk about all of the different themes, but expanded on it to such an extent that we actually had too much data to wrap up in the report that was actually submitted. And it's something that we want to kind of develop further. So myself and Maeve will be presenting at the Landscape Forum in Waterford in September, and we will hopefully publish a couple of papers out of this for landscape research and possibly attend other conferences. But in terms of the concluded themes, what actually came out of this part of the research, because this was only dealing with a small section of it, was that there was a strong association with childhood memories. There was mental well-being of being in the landscape. So basically people talked extensively about how they felt and how being in these both landscapes improved their mental well-being. And obviously there's been a lot of research done on that in previous years, and Ulrich in particular has written an awful lot about mental well-being in the landscape. But deeper than that, there was definitely a spiritual connection with both landscapes. Now, this seemed to be greater in terms of the sea, because some people who were actually mountain walkers were very much more concerned with the physicality of it, the physicality of actually scaling, the mountains and getting to the top peak. And, and they did have appreciation of the aesthetics of the landscape, which was definitely felt by both cohorts. And then there was an appreciation in the naturalness and the ecology of the landscape. And this definitely came through a lot in terms of the need to protect these landscapes to ensure that, their naturalness and their beauty is maintained. And then lastly, the thrill of partaking in activities within the landscape. So I'm just going to leave you with this finally, and this is me. And I'm thinking of the anticipation of the feeling of the water on my skin, enjoying the first shock of the cold water as my body enters it, and then the switching off of my mind as I begin to swim. The blue-green water and the choppy waves, the call of the seagull overhead, and the colours of the cliffs as I swim past. When I stop somewhere out, away from everyone, in the middle of Tramore Bay, I look up at the sky and I take in the beauty of the environment around me. As I write this, I feel the emotion of my own connection to the landscape bubbling up inside me, and the sense of peace that the thought of this landscape elicits. And I was swimming this morning, and this was exactly how I felt. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jane. That was great. Swimming this morning. Oh, we're all feeling like very envious about that, I think. Again, that was a great journey through another landscape and another space molded by water and rock and emotion. I thought it was really interesting what you said about how people thought of the water as another skin, that sort of fluid attachment to a particular, to a very different sort of environment that we only enter into temporarily. Some of us very temporarily. So thanks to all of our speakers for a series of really fabulous explorations of landscape that connected really nicely together in many ways, I thought. Has anybody got questions for our presenters? Either in the chat or elsewhere. Thanks, Jack, for your question. Jack asks, says, I'm curious if any of your participants mentioned fear about change to mountainous landscapes and seascapes attributed to renewable energy. So this is a question for Jane. Onshore winds regularly cited in upland mountainous landscapes due to high wind speeds. So is that something that you encountered, Jane, questions about renewables? You're on mute, sorry.
People didn't actually talk about that, and that is obviously something that would come up if it was the situation. But the Comras isn't actually the tallest of the mountain ranges in Ireland, and in fact it's relatively small. There has been moves to put wind farms in some places, but this is more me talking as a practitioner, and there's been a lot of opposition to it. I think because they are protected as SAC, mountains, then I think there could be an awful lot of issues with actually putting wind turbines up there. There has been some talk about offshore wind generation, but as yet there's been no plans to put anything in Tramore Bay. So to answer your question, Jack, it didn't really come up in conversation, but I'm sure that if there were moves to put any of those in, it would be at the forefront of people's minds.
Thanks, Jane, for your answer. Emily.
Yeah, I know that all three of the projects had really unfortunate timing of being COVID. And I know all three of you all four of you were affected by COVID. Would you mind telling us how, in terms of practicalities, I think some of you couldn't travel, but do you think that skewed your outputs and results a little bit and change your direction slightly, maybe?
I think for me, the difficulty for Maeve and I was that we couldn't travel outside of our 2 kilometres, and so we couldn't go to the Comras. But once travel opened up, we were able to get out there. But I think that we did all of our interviews on Zoom, and I think we would have got a lot more if we'd actually met people face to face.
Yeah, if I can go, I think for me, having to go to Japan, of course, that was not possible during most of the time of the grant. But I was very fortunate because in 2020, when COVID happened, I was actually stuck in Japan. So I had time to get to know many of the stakeholders already. So what I did in 2021 and partly 2022 was to sort of talk to them online and then have a German friend that lives in Japan and works for Tohoku University. She was able to collect a lot of the material for me using cameras, etc. And then actually finally, last year in 2022, I was also finally able to go myself and collect my own interviews and set the stage for, well, I already had half of the material for the documentary, but we redid interviews with better cameras and better expertise, let's say.
Yeah, we can say something short also about trying to get to Greenland. It was a project, I think, in itself, like kind of negotiating the political and institutional restrictions. But we noticed that a lot of restrictions were also based on the idea of tourism, and the idea actually that a lot of scientific studies were actually still allowed to be undertaken during COVID because they were seen as beneficial to science. So we actually changed the political makeup of the project to be more scientific positioning, just to enter certain territories. So it's really about this idea of like, what is valued actually in terms of research. And that was kind of a really interesting side story, I think, to our project, was like this devaluation just because it's artistic research rather than scientific research. So we kind of negotiated that field, which I think was an interesting project in itself.
That's really fascinating. So but also the idea that science itself is just a set of narratives. So as long as you kind of decode the language and position your stuff to fit the language, you can beat the system. Dina.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having this, and it's been really interesting to listen to the different presentations. So just to situate myself, I've been living and working in Svalbard, in Longyearbyen, which is the world's northernmost town. So this is where I've done a lot of my work, and actually there's quite a bit of overlap with both Jane and Ana Claudia. But I had a question in terms of this notion of remaining vulnerable in the landscape. I've been thinking quite a bit also about what it means to be safe and what that does and how that impacts. But in addition to that, one of the things that's come up in the work that I've done is also, where is the sense of agency? Who has agency, who doesn't? And when do you lose the agency? So I was wondering if this is something that you've noticed, because for me, it comes into play very much in terms of going out into that Arctic landscape.
Absolutely. Actually, I will be working, but I want more data on that, on a paper just about that, because in a sense, the seawalls are not even the real problem. The seawalls are just a metaphor for this loss of agency, the populations that the residents are perceiving in relation to the government. So they sort of took the seawall, okay, that's the problem, but that's not the real problem. If you interview them, and I've known them very well since 2014, I go every year in the same communities. They're all, after half an hour and a few beers, they're all talking about how the government cheated and built the seawalls. And actually, I call it disaster capitalism. I want to be very clear about this, because the tactics that the government, both at the national and prefectural level, used are part of disaster capitalism, in the sense that they actually had meetings, participative meetings with the communities in times where they knew that the fishermen, people mostly take the voice of certain categories. Sorry, I see my connection is unstable, so sorry if that was not clear, but everything was targeted to so that they could not have enough agency. Yes, so absolutely.
Thanks, Ana Claudia. Shirley has a question. Shirley's is one of our current research grant holders. So it's really nice to see you, Shirley. Over to you for your question. You're on mute.
Rookie error. Thank you all for those presentations. They're all really fascinating, and it's great to see the variety of work that the LRG is supporting. I've got a couple of questions, if I may, to two different projects. Susanna, and the Out of Focus project is fantastically evocative, and you talked really eloquently about the sounds that you were collecting and how intrinsic that was to the landscape and to your research. Is there a way that we can kind of access that, or what are your plans for that material, that data?
Yeah, as we mentioned earlier, we're working now on a cinema expanded piece, we call it. So some sort of visualization of our research in a cinematic format, where the soundscape will be literally woven out of these geomagnetic waves. So the data is sonified, and that will provide the basis for the soundtrack. So yeah, it will be audiovisual immersion in that landscape. Yeah.
And the work you were doing also really made me think of Semiconductor's work. You know, that Earthworks piece, that's which was made so much more powerful by the element of sound in it when it's shown as an installation.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear more when it's ready to experience.
sure. Yeah, we actually normally do these. We call them like deep listening sessions after a talk, where we normally in the physicality of the space we would play the sounds. And you kind of decentralize your vision by being blindfolded, and then you tune in to these earth frequencies. So it's really exciting to explore that sensory input.
Yeah, sounds fascinating. Yeah, thank you. And Anna Claudia, I was really interested by the rocks that you were describing on the kind of periphery of the tsunami, and you can see from the images they've got text on them, and you mentioned that they're kind of like a kind of warning, don't go beyond this point. I was wondering whether any of them have include any more if you like, sort of philosophical comments on the relationship with the landscape, or the relationships with weather, and the kind of balance between community.
No, not the stones, because they are very functional in the landscape. So actually, I interpreted them as saying, do not go beyond this point, because everyone in coastal Japan knows that that's what they mean. But actually what they say is just practical data, factual data about the specific disaster. So the date, the number of victims, and all of that, just to scare people, we could say. Nowadays, there's different takes. They still do them, but they use them as memorials at the same time. So there's this idea that using them also as memorial gives them a sort of new meaning, in which it conflates the idea of the casualties, the people, the bereaved, and everyone who suffered from that disaster. And usually it comes with the writing that is in Japanese, but also in English nowadays, and in Chinese, which is, I think, a Buddhist sentence. May all living beings live in peace. May all beings find peace, I think it says. So you can find it everywhere in the landscape when a disaster has happened. But if I can add one last thing, there are also other projects that are related to the tsunami stones, but it's like usually paper scrolls. The Shinto priestess I interviewed, she is actually doing a very long paper scrolls in which she's outlining all the disasters that have hit the area. And by doing that, she wants them to make them public for the population, so they can have an idea that disaster is part of the landscape. It's not going anywhere. It's us who have to adapt to that, and not building wall is not the solution.
Thank you. Thank you. That's fascinating.
Thank you.
A question in mind, but if anyone else has anything that they want to jump in with first. Brian.
Thank you very much. It's back to you, Anna Claudia, I'm afraid. I'm really curious to know how this work might be propagated further around this learning, and this, especially around how public bodies work with communities on resilience measures. Because it strikes me that this is going to become a really, unfortunately, hugely important topic over the coming decades, as we're unable to decarbonize, it seems. So there's going to be a lot of really difficult choices to be made by communities and by local authorities in terms of how we defend ourselves against various climate effects. So this ability of the communities and the authorities to work together in a much more collaborative way is going to be hugely important. So some important lessons, I guess, to be learned from your work and others.
Yeah, absolutely. There is also a cultural component, of course. I think, I don't want to generalize, but because we don't have a lot of time, Japan is a very top-down country in which, well, my title, if I have to unpack my title, there's no actual protests. People are protesting in their own ways, but there's not a big movement going out and saying, we don't want the walls. Yes, there's people doing that, but in subtle ways, in more nuanced ways, because protests are not something that exists in Japan in the way we Europeans imagine it. So they have to resort to other means, and proposing alternatives is for them already a form of deep protest. I did talk to policymakers and I did talk to a lot of academics. I had the fortune of being connected to Tohoku University, who is actually the academic body that supported the construction of the seawalls. They gave all the engineering data, all the architectural data. So I spoke with one of the main engineers involved in the project, and I asked him very simply, is this okay? Like, do you agree with the data that you've given? And it's like, I agree with the data. I don't agree with the walls, but you know how Japan works. So it's that kind of situation in which you can put the data out, put the interviews out, do a short documentary and hope that it goes around. There's a lot of material about this that is coming out, but I think this has to do with a more long-term strategy of the government, which is to maintain its economy high, especially now, by sort of foraging construction companies. And one of the ways in which they do that is with reconstruction and seawalls. And in southern Japan, where you don't actually have tsunamis, with the constant of it's not necessary. Sorry, I went too political, but I think it's important to also recognize that part.
Thank you.
Anybody else have questions? I have if there are no further questions, I have one sort of wrap-up question, which I'd like to pose to all of our presenters, which is, how did you find, or did you find that the theme of the research awards, landscape and virtue and the common good, did that change your projects in any way or enhance them, or did it tease something out of the project that maybe was implicit but you hadn't thought of? I suppose I'm interested to think about how not only the funding, but how some of the themes that we position, how they intersect with the work that people are doing in landscape. So
maybe I can start, because
yeah, sure.
Yeah, because for me it was very clear. I was already sort of starting to work on that topic, but what I didn't realize when I read the call, the common virtue and the common good, what I thought was I was working on this idea of vulnerability and I couldn't place the sort of scope and the scale. And when I read the call, I realized, oh, for a year I've been working on an issue, not realizing that for the communities, it was a landscape issue. So that sort of gave the starting point and said, yes, we are talking about landscape. We're not just talking about risk and vulnerability. This is embedded in reality, in a real landscape. So then it was very easy to refrain because it sort of made sense when I read the call. Yeah, so for me it was
nice.
Yeah, for us it was a similar story because we have been already working with these themes. However, perhaps the phrasing of the proposal, the commodity, common good, the garden and the grave, really grounded our project. So also thinking along the lines, the landscape that is active and living and growing versus landscape that is fragmented, charted, put into parts and then commodified and taken profit of. So perhaps, yeah, it made me really, at least I'm speaking for myself, it made me put things in order in my head. And it was a very refreshing experience to, yeah, to have come across this proposal to kind of bounce our project off of that.
It's also interesting to take something theoretical and then apply it to field research, right? To then apply that to a very specific place and a very specific time with very specific communities, and then see how those words, those articles, those ideas actually also come into being, right? And I think that was something that really happened when we were also situated at the site of research, was that there is definitely this very strong duality between the garden and the grave, right? So I think it's also something we want to also push further in our communication of the project, is this constant duality of the landscape being observed.
Coexisting also, because there's no answer whether one or the other would benefit Greenlanders more. There's this chance and this kind of, yeah, tragedy of choice. So yeah, that was quite interesting.
I suppose in terms of landscape justice, we did look at sort of access to the landscape, and it's something which we really need to explore a little bit more. One of the, you notice the demographics that I put up there, that everybody that we interviewed was white. And that's not a representation at all of the demographics of either of the areas. And that's one of the things that we did look at, was sort of, you know, why were people not perhaps going to those two landscapes, you know, and some of that was around sort of access and ease of access. And it's one element of the research that we haven't really investigated a lot more. And I suppose the other thing is, as an ecologist, I was very concerned about really why people, you know, whether people had an intimate relationship with the ecology, and whether they were concerned about the ecology, and whether that impacted on some of the activities that they did, and whether they, you know, because if my feeling was that if people had strong associations with a landscape and that improved their mental health and well-being, that they may be more inclined to actually protect that landscape, or to basically be involved in, you know, be active in actually maintaining that landscape and actually fighting against, you know, the pressures that there are against those landscapes. So, and that definitely did come out in the research, where people were very concerned about the landscapes being maintained and conservation. And although a lot of the respondents weren't explicitly aware of the ecology, in the sense that they didn't know what necessarily the names of things were, what the plants were. You know, people did talk about the orchids in the sand dunes. They did talk about the rare species of birds on the backstrand in Tremor. They did talk about, you know, seeing eagles in the mountains. They did talk about, you know, the colours of all the different vegetation. And they were definitely aware of the importance of these landscapes from a conservation point of view. And you know, I suppose that was one of the things that I wanted to draw out, was that, you know, if people had a close association with these landscapes on a spiritual level, were they involved in actually practically, you know, doing something to preserve them? And that was definitely the case.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to our presenters. It's been a great way to spend an hour and a half. And really good to see and to hear that we are able to support such amazing projects, and really interesting to see how that engagement with the theme operated on the ground in different ways. Emily, Brian, do you have anything you want to say before we wrap up?
I just wanted to say a big call out to Emily for all her hard work in preparing this presentation. So thank you, Emily, for putting together all the practical side of things, making sure we're here, and making sure that people knew about it as well. So yeah, thanks very much, Emily. Great work. And Karen, thanks again for taking your time out to host this as well.
absolutely my pleasure. It's been great.
It's all been very worth it. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. And do keep in touch with your research, please. Tag us in our socials and all that kind of thing, so we can get it out there, because we really like to see how you progress your research. Thank you so much. Thank you, Karen.
Okay, thanks all. Have a good weekend, and hope to catch you again soon at one of our forthcoming events.